Ontario Premier Doug Ford is on the offense, doubling down on his threat to stop energy exports to the U.S., prompting mixed reaction from other premiers.
You come and attack Ontario, you attack livelihoods of people of Ontario and Canadians. We're going to use every tool in our toolbox to defend.
From Newfoundland and Labrador's perspective, we have no interest in stopping the flow of oil and gas.
Better secure the border. I think we have to do that. It's a lot better than getting 25% tariffs starting on January 21. So I prefer that than starting a war and stopping sending energy to the United States.
The Canadian government and other provinces are beginning to think about what a Canadian response would be. We are preparing our list and starting to think through what those options should look like.
Meanwhile, Alberta unveils its plan to secure its portion of the U.S. border, announcing $29 million worth of new officers, dogs, and drones. Plus, they'll create what they're calling a red zone along the border. It's a 2-kilometer area where sheriffs will be able to make arrests without a warrant, targeting people they think are trying to cross the border illegally or trying to move illegal drugs or weapons. This is part of Premier Danielle Smith's diplomatic approach to Donald Trump's tariff threats. Danielle Smith is the Premier of Alberta, and she joins us once again today. Premier, welcome back to the show.
Hi, David.
This 2-kilometer red zone, how exactly will that work? I mean, how can police officers in Canada arrest people without warrants for getting too close to the border?
Well, as you know, we've got a Critical Infrastructure Defense Act that we passed a number of years ago, and that allows for us to declare an area as applicable under that act to give us the authority to go in and police it. You have to remember, we've got a 298-kilometer border with Montana, and if anybody is sneaking across the border, they're doing it for probably not good reasons. And so I think that this is going to be legitimate. It's very interesting that we've already had landowners in the area calling us saying whatever we can do to help. So we're looking forward to rolling out the plan. It sounds like we'll have some boots near the border before the early on in the new year.
But patrolling for presence and patrolling for deterrence is different than actually arresting people who come within 2 kilometers of the border. I mean, have you done a charter assessment of this to see if it works? Because you do need probable cause to actually detain people. And if they're just moving towards the border without having committed a crime, how do you stop them?
Well, you look and see if they've got drugs on them. You look and see if they're trafficking human beings. You look and see if they've got illegal guns on them, and it will be able to go both ways. I mean, I think what we'll probably find is that most of the work that we're going to end up doing is going to have this secondary station set up at the official borders so that we can check more vehicles coming across. So that's going to be another aspect of it, is why we've got a dog team. But we know that we have to understand a little bit more about what is happening along our border. It's why we've got 10 drone teams that we'll put up as well. But we're taking an all hands on deck approach to this. We know we've got a fentanyl problem in this province, and we're going to resolve it.
But, you know, Premier, you're a big civil liberties person. I don't think I'm mischaracterizing you with that description. I suspect civil liberties groups will have a lot of questions about the idea of a 2-kilometer zone where people can be arrested without a warrant. That is not something we typically do here, right?
Well, I guess we'll see. I mean, don't carry illegal drugs, don't carry illegal guns, and don't traffic in human beings, and you'll probably be fine. But we cannot allow for the lack of policing on the border to create an open season for criminals. And the fact of the matter is, we know that drugs are getting here somehow. Precursor drugs are getting here somehow. Illegal guns are getting here somehow. We have an initiative with Paul Brandt, not in my city, because of human trafficking. That's getting here somehow. And whatever we're doing right now is not stopping that inflow of criminals using our border for bad reasons. And so we're going to do what we can to make sure that we stop all of those activities.
But how do you know it is the Alberta-Montana border that's the problem and not, say, the Saskatchewan-Alberta border or the British Columbia-Alberta border, right? I mean, how do you know it's not coming from inside other parts of Canada? Because it's just as likely, it seems, to be going east-west as north-south in some cases.
Well, good thing we'll have 51 dedicated sheriff teams, seven teams, 10 drones, 4 dog teams as well. And if we find that there isn't a problem at the Montana border, then we've got a team that we can deploy wherever there is a problem. But I don't think that just because we haven't found anything yet doesn't mean we're not going to find anything. We don't know what we don't know. And that's part of the reason why we're putting such a strong force all along that border, because we want to make sure that we're doing what we can to address the issues of both incoming and outgoing criminal activity. activity.
What is the governor of Montana and others in Montana, what are they saying to you about this plan? I know you were working with them on some sort of joint initiatives. I mean, what's their view on what you've announced?
Well, I gave Montana Governor Giannaforte a call so that he knew that this was coming, and we want to collaborate with him. We're now working on having a summit so that we can identify the joint issues that we have and see what we can do to be able to address them. Look, I mean, we know that we've got an overdose crisis largely caused by fentanyl in Alberta, and many U.S. cities have the same problem. So I think that there's a real interest in working together to be able to have our law enforcement teams working to be able to solve it and make sure that we're able to cut down on that kind of crime.
So speaking of working together, you and your premier counterparts had another meeting with the Prime Minister and his cabinet ministers last night, where you talked about the border plan. Doug Ford says they have a plan. As chair of the Council of the Federation, they just have to implement it. Were you satisfied with what you saw from the federal government last night as a response to this point to the threat of tariffs from Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think they've heard the message from the premiers that we have to take the border issue seriously, and so they've got a five-point plan. We'll hear more about it, I'm sure, in the economic statement. But everything that they've put forward really syncs up with what we're doing in Alberta. So we've already reached out to CBSA, the border security, as well as reached out to the RCMP so that we can have an integrated approach. And we're looking forward to seeing what the federal government puts forward. We had to go through our own internal process to get the dollar allocation for it. We're putting $29 million towards our effort. And I suspect we'll see a little bit more detail once the economic statement comes out on December 16th about the kind of dollars the feds are prepared to put on the table.
Well, Doug Ford came out last night saying, as a last resort, he's willing to cut off energy to the United States because Ontario sends enough electricity to New York, Wisconsin, and other states to keep the lights on at about 1.5 million homes. Was this discussed and agreed to at the First Minister's table? Because maybe Doug Ford can divert that electricity to other markets inside Canada. Your oil has to go to those refineries. Well, what's your view on the idea of stopping energy exports to the U.S.?
Well, I know all of the premiers and even the Prime Minister expressed some view about getting into a tariff war. I have to be frank. I told them I disagree with that approach. I think that tariffs just hurt consumers. If we put 25% tariffs on goods coming in from America, they pay 25% more for their ketchup and their playing cards and their cherries and their bourbon and whatever else it is that the federal government would decide to put them on. Similarly, I think our stronger argument to the Americans is that if they put a 25% tariff on oil and gas, it will just increase the cost of gasoline at the pump. This is what I was arguing when I was down at the Western Governors Conference, is that our calculations suggest it would be as much as $1 a gallon that would increase the price of gasoline, and that costs the governors to pay attention. So I think that if we frame it that way, that we have an integrated economy, that American consumers benefit from the fact that we do have this integrated economy, I think that's a better pathway. We want to sell more Alberta energy to the United States. We don't want to sell less.
Right, but Premier Smith, with respect, the governors aren't your problem, right? It's the president-elect. And he must know, because he's been president before, about the integrated nature of the economy, and he's still threatening to do this, right? So if he does drop this hammer on his closest friend and trading partner, as the rhetoric goes, there has to be some sort of response. Does there not from Canada? I mean, Doug Ford's talking about electricity. People have talked about critical metals and minerals. They're talking about export taxes on things like uranium and maybe energy if it's carved out. I mean, where do you stand on that idea? Do you think there's no retaliation that Canada should do?
I think we should lead with diplomacy. That's what we're doing. That's why we're taking a serious approach on the border. Those are the issues the U.S. president-elect has identified. We want to show that we take those seriously. We've got the similar problems as well. And what I would like to see is for the federal government to unroll their border plan and see where that takes us. But I think it's way premature to be talking about retaliation or turning off any of our export products into the United States. I think that is only going to antagonize and potentially make it worse. We want to be seen as the reliable source of energy to the United States. And you do not make that argument if you're threatening to cut these things off. So we're not at all interested in taking that approach. And I've let the premiers know that.
You're not at all interested right now, or not at all interested at any point? Like, is this a card you're never willing to play?
Under no circumstances would I ever want to see Alberta energy cut off into the United States. Under no circumstances. I mean, there's a lot of wars that have been fought around the world when countries end up playing those kinds of power games, and we shouldn't be in a position where we're playing that. We have a great relationship with the United States. Energy security is one of the keys for us getting a deal, and we undermine that if it looks like in any way we're not going to be that secure, reliable, friendly partner. So I just want to make sure we're nipping that one in the bud. We can talk about what future approaches might be, but we shouldn't be playing games.
But just as a final point, does that maybe weaken Canada's hand? If you can't say all options are on the table in response as a country, I come from an oil exporting province as well in Newfoundland and Labrador, and I know what it would mean to the economy there to not do it, and I get the stakes. But as a nationally, don't you need to say to Donald Trump and his administration, we're united on this, and taking one option away could be a domino effect that weakens the overall position for Canada?
I think our position would be to wait it out. If it is the case that they put 25% tariffs on energy, it will be in pretty short order that American consumers start hurting as a result of that. And so that's the bargaining chip that we have, is that all of the things that the president is talking about are going to hurt American consumers. They're going to increase the cost of food, increase the cost of housing materials, increase the cost of cars, increase the cost of energy. And I would say that becomes our point of leverage, is when that becomes clear and consumers start complaining about it, then we're able to say, well, let's talk about what the pressure points are and let's get back to the table and negotiate a better deal.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, always appreciate the time. I suspect we'll talk to you again pretty soon. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks, David.
What we're sending a message to the U.S., you come and attack Ontario, you attack livelihoods of people of Ontario and Canadians. We're going to use every tool in our toolbox to defend Ontarians and Canadians across the border. That's the last thing we want to do. Would we do it? Let's wait and see.
So that's Ontario Premier Doug Ford threatening again today to cut off energy to the United States if President-elect Donald Trump imposes tariffs, a measure that would turn off the lights, or at least the supply for those lights, to 1.5 million U.S. homes. While Ford points a stick, Alberta is offering a carrot, offering a $29 million plan to beef up its border with the United States. And Premier Danielle Smith says her approach is diplomacy, not threats.
Let me be clear from the Alberta perspective. Under no circumstances will Alberta agree to cut off oil and gas exports. We don't support tariffs. I don't support tariffs on Canadian goods, and I don't support tariffs on U.S. goods, because all it does is make life more expensive for everyday Canadians and everyday Americans. So instead, we're taking a diplomatic approach, and we're meeting with our allies in the U.S. We're making the case for Alberta oil and gas to be part of the solution to energy affordability, to energy security.
Okay, the guy who caused all of this is President-elect Donald Trump, and he was asked this morning about Ontario's threat to stop energy exports to the U.S.
Well, that's okay if he does that, that's fine, but the United States is subsidizing Canada. It's truly a subsidy, and we shouldn't have to do that. And we have a great relationship. I have so many friends in Canada, but we shouldn't have to subsidize a country, and we're subsidizing them for more than $100 billion a year. And we shouldn't have to be doing that.
Okay, according to that reporter who's with CNBC, Trump later said off camera that he hopes to work something out with Canada. The federal government here is preparing to announce a near $1 billion plan to secure the border, at least as an initial step. So we're going to talk about all of these things with the Power Panel. Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. James Moore is a former Conservative cabinet minister. Andrew Thompson is a former Saskatchewan NDP cabinet minister. And here with me is Laura D'Angelo, a former advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in his office. Good to see you all. James, I'm going to come to you because you were on that NAFTA council all those years ago. What do you make of this sort of divergence of approach in the premiers, from Ford and Smith being at the opposite ends of it?
There's nothing wrong with some good cop, bad cop, and there's nothing wrong with different parts of the country explaining the different impacts the tariffs will have on them and their bordering U.S. states. I mean, don't forget, of course, Premier Ford is likely going into an election campaign in a few more weeks. And so I think the tough guy prose that he has is probably more appropriate to an Ontario audience and a constituency that's probably a little bit more adversarial to Donald Trump than Danielle Smith, who's not about to go into an election campaign and whose caucus and party membership is probably more friendly to Donald Trump and more adversarial towards Justin Trudeau. So I think that's why you see a little bit of difference in tone there. But I think that the U.S. Embassy on Sussex there, as they're preparing their transition documents for incoming Secretary of State Marco Rubio, when they point out the different things that have happened since President Trump threatened the 25% tariffs, I think the Ontario threat is the one that'll be noticed more because, the dusting off of the maps of the energy grids between Canada and the United States is something that'll be noticed, I think, by the White House. And I think it'll raise an eyebrow with Secretary of State Rubio more than, 20 drones and 10 patrol dogs along the Alberta-Montana border will.
That's quite possible. Andrew, I wonder, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, Doug Ford, I am not an expert on the Ontario electrical grid. I will confess that up front. But there might be ways to reroute that electricity to different parts of Canada to meet other needs should you stop sending it to the U.S. But that oil in Alberta has got to go into those pipelines and it's got to get to those refineries, right? So the economic stakes could be different, but the messages are also a little bit different.
Yeah, it's interesting that the Conservatives don't really have a united position on this at this point. It's some of it is obviously regional. Ford is in a really tough spot here in Ontario, as James has pointed out. He's getting ready to try to gear up for an election. The economy is going through a very tough time here. It's lost 33,000 manufacturing jobs over the last year. The unemployment in Toronto is nearing 10%. Unemployment overall in Ontario is 2 points higher than it is in Quebec. Ford is in a tough spot, and he needs to look tough on the economy. One of the ways to do that is to pick this fight. Now, the problem with turning off electricity is, of course, our natural gas in Ontario actually flows through the United States. So I suspect if we flick off their lights, they turn off our furnaces, which is probably not the smartest move overall. But I mean, Ford's interested in making the headline, not about thinking through the policy on this.
Well, as someone with a natural gas furnace, Laura, I do not want to lose access to the heating. I have 2 kids under 10. But what do you make of what we're seeing after the First Minister's meeting from the premiers?
I think one of the things that has really struck me that Andrew mentioned as well is it's really interesting seeing all of these Conservative premiers who are not aligned, and it makes sense why. But it is interesting to watch Doug Ford, who historically in the first round of negotiations and in COVID very much had a Team Canada kind of champion approach. And he's now taking a Captain Canada tough guy image likely because of the election. But I'm not sure the public quibbling among all of the premiers is super helpful. I do take the good cop, bad cop idea, but we also know the Americans are watching our media closely right now. They are watching for weaknesses. They are watching for fractions among the Federation that they can exploit. And so I'm not sure that in public, this is really what we need to be doing right now.
Shachi, can we dismiss everything Doug Ford does as just being about this possible early election? Or is this like, he always does this hands-on thing. I remember during COVID, I'll drive the truck and get the vaccines, you know what I mean? And sort of like, I'll cut off your power because this is crazy. It's kind of in keeping with the Doug Ford that I have observed over the years. What do you think?
So there's an element of Doug Ford is going to Doug Ford, and he's going to shoot from the hip on this, and he's got the heft to, as James pointed out. Ontario, as a player in these negotiations, certainly has a greater weight and a greater heft than, say, Atlantic Canada or Saskatchewan or Manitoba. Not to say that they don't matter, but Ontario really, really matters. But it is hard to get away from, I think, something that we've all expressed now. There is this election coming up, but what we're seeing is both in Alberta and in Ontario, premiers who are communicating probably what they think. Obviously, I don't think they're going out and saying things that they don't think or that they're not prepared to do or maybe aren't prepared to at least threaten doing, but they're also very much talking to their own audiences. We've done polling and we've talked to Canadians. Should we, as a country, in your province, play hardball or do everything you can to avoid the tariffs? It's very notable that in Alberta, it's the least number of people who say, let's play hardball. People are most likely to say, let's do everything we can to avoid those tariffs. In Ontario, very different story. Nearly half the province says we should play hardball. So Doug Ford is talking to Ontarians. He's also talking to Michigan. He's talking to other places. But we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, David, and I talked about that Team Canada analogy. Yes, they're all wearing the jerseys, but are they skating in the same direction? Well, today Doug Ford basically got on the Zamboni and just drove out of the ring. And that's the equivalent of what's happened here. And, in terms of the relationship with those states, with Michigan, with other states that rely on the electricity, as James has pointed out, Is that going to get some eyebrows arched in Washington? Sure, it's also going to get eyebrows arched at the state houses with those governors.
So, James, just on this, like Doug Ford may be talking to Ontarians, but he's also been talking to a lot of Americans, going on CNBC, going on Fox News, running ads, you know, in various markets in the United States. I mean, do you think they're seeing and hearing this message, or, you know, are we up here in Canada screaming back and forth with panic to each other while the Americans just kind of go about their day? Do you think these threats and arguments and rebuttals and offers of border work, do you think it's being heard in the United States?
Yeah, yes, and I think there's a distinct message coming from Canada that will resonate relative to what will be said by President Sheinbaum and the Mexican delegation in Washington. And I think it's important for us to be on there in those media markets saying the important things. I'm very glad that you played, by the way, that second clip with the background noise of President Trump walking through, I guess that was Mar-a-Lago, talking
No,
about,
he was on the floor of the stock exchange, just so you know where he was. Yeah, there you go.
All right. But you know, talking about, you know, we have a $100 billion deficit, or they have $100 billion. So again, we have to go back to like core numbers here. When Donald Trump became president of the United States in 2016, the United States debt was $20 trillion. Today, the U.S. debt is $35 trillion. And the debt goes up $1 trillion new dollars every 100 days. So 20 to 35 and $1 trillion in new debt is being added every 100 days. And that's before Donald Trump lowers the corporate taxes down to 15%. Right. Donald Trump views this as a cash grab. If we were to find a way to demonstrate over the next 200 days that there's not a drop of fentanyl that found its way into the United States, there's not one illegal gun, there's not one illegal migrant, and there's not one threat coming from the Canada-U.S. border, frankly, it wouldn't really matter. What Donald Trump sees this as is a cash grab and a way to repatriate American-made manufacturing and American jobs and cash for this massive trade imbalance that he sees is accretive in a negative way to America's economic interests. It's bad economics. It's not true, but it's how he sees it. And you have to accept reality on reality's terms in terms of how he sees the American fiscal picture and Canada and squeezing us for some cash as a remedy. It's not correct, but it's what it is.
Well, Andrew, I can't imagine Chrystia Freeland has $100 billion U.S. in the fall economic statement coming on Monday. But, you know, Trump looks at trade imbalances and calls that a subsidy when it's because of the natural resources and the oil that they buy from this country. It's just, what do? It goes up in value and you end up with a trade deficit, but they need the energy supply. And I think James' analysis is right. So how do you, if it is not necessarily about fentanyl and people, but about cash, how do you win this whole negotiation with a guy who doesn't quite see things the way the consensus views it?
Yeah, I think the big question is, between now and the midterms, what happens with the American economy? Let's assume he puts the tariffs on. This is going to have a massive inflationary impact on the Americans, on things that they're super sensitive about, not just the home heating, but the actual price of gas in their vehicles. And nobody's addicted to the price of gas quite the same way that the Americans are. So this is going to have a pretty negative impact. Now, of course, you can expect what Trump will do is he'll blame Canada for, of course, the tariffs for the gas being so expensive now. And Canadians have, increased this price. Of course, it's all his government doing it. But in Donald Trump's logic, that doesn't really matter. So it's very hard to kind of fight against that kind of phantom argument that keeps moving around on us. I'm not sure that there's too much that can be done. What I will say is that the discrepancy of views, or the divergence of views amongst the premiers, to a certain extent, though, does play into Trudeau's hand of being able to say, look, I've got a whole bunch of crazy up here on all sides. What we've got to figure out is how to put together, something that works for the country as a whole, that doesn't end up, letting them freeze in the dark down there, but at the same time, is more than, a few Mounties riding their horses along the Alberta border. Trudeau has an opportunity to come out looking like a leader on that. How he gets there, I think, are the pieces that need to unfold fairly quickly.
Well, it's interesting, Laura. We know there is a border plan of some sort that the Premier seemed reassured by. Danielle Smith said earlier in the show it's a 5-point plan that she thinks we'll see details of in the fall economic statement. But there's also reporting, first by Bloomberg, I believe it was my colleague Brian Platt, that has been confirmed to us as accurate, that they're looking at last resort things like export taxes on things like Canadian energy and uranium and critical minerals, should those be exempted by Donald Trump, to hit back and deny cheap access to the things the Americans really want.
Yeah, and this is a tactic we also saw in 2018. This government will leak some strategic things that they could do to clap back, if you want to call it that, or to respond to Donald Trump. And I think it's a smart strategy. We need to be showing that we're not just going to take a knee to these tariffs and what's happening. But those are also really big things that the government is talking about.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting. It plays, I think, into what Andrew's talking about, which is it's an opportunity for the Prime Minister and this government to take all of the little bits that the premiers are talking about and put together a cohesive plan, or at least look like it's them putting that plan together.
So Shachi, you said you looked at some numbers, right, on how Canadians feel in different parts of the country about how to deal with these things. Doug Ford is saying, get the tariff list ready, let's cut off the electricity, maybe we stop putting American liquor in the LCBO, fight, fight, fight. Danielle Smith says under no circumstances would energy go out, and she's focusing on diplomacy and not retaliation. So I don't know if it's a card she's never willing to play, but it's certainly one she's never willing to play right now. But broadly, I mean, how prepared do you think Canadians would be for a whole of the country fight on the tariff front to push back if Trump does what he's threatening to do? Because that is going to hurt on top of the pain that Trump will be inflicting in both directions.
Canadians are under no illusion, David, about how much this is going to hurt, how uncomfortable this can and will be. They are understanding that this isn't a fight that we've picked, that we've sought out. And, you know, people are fairly mixed about how do you ultimately mitigate the damage, right? We know it's going to hurt. You've got majorities in this country who say that they expect that a Trump presidency is not only going to be bad overall for the Canadian economy, but for their own provincial economies, for their own pocketbook, for their mental health. That is certainly one of the findings that's a real finding. Go look it up. It's on the website. So, you know, people are worried. They're anxious. They're worried. And I think one of the observations I make is when the trial balloons are floated in scrums, whether it's we're going to go and lobby for energy and we've got a plan at the border and we're not going to fight, or it's no, you can't have electricity anymore and get ready with other tariffs that are going to be slapped on, it all adds to the uncertainty and it all adds to the anxiety. And the general gestalt that is given off by this, it's like it's the living embodiment of sauve qui peut. It's like everybody panic, everyone for themselves, get out while you can or do what you have to do. There may be some method to this, and you've talked about this before, David, in terms of other things Doug Ford has said over the last couple of weeks, whether it's, we should ignore Mexico and carve out Mexico, or whatever it is. People are going to have views and takes on how to best mitigate what's coming at them. But when it looks and sounds as what's the right word? Just all over the place and incoherent as it does at the moment, with different leaders, different premiers saying different things in different places at different times, that doesn't send a very strong signal to Canadians in terms of their level of confidence, either in the federal government or in their own provincial governments to handle this. It just adds to anxiety.
Well, you know, James, there may be an incoherence there, as Shachi calls it, but constitutionally, you know, Doug Ford can go to the U.S., but he is not the trade minister. He is not the foreign affairs minister. That all does fall to Justin Trudeau and his cabinet. So on that question of retaliation, where the premiers aren't necessarily in alignment, I mean, how do you think they approach it if you can't sway Trump with whatever this 5-point border plan is going to be?
Well, I can tell you there's a lot of scrambling happening right now by people who are trying to make sure that their commodities are not on the countervailing list. This happened last time when Canada did countervailing duties in response to the 232 tariffs against steel and aluminum in Canada. And there are a lot of goods and commodities from coffee to dried goods to energy to auto parts, and they're trying to make sure that they're not going to be included on a countervailing list from Canada. So there's a full court press 24/7 happening in Ottawa right now with lobbyists. I know that that's happening. So there's a lot of anxiety about that. Danielle Smith might have a different approach to this as well, because our mutual friend, my former colleague James Rajad, is in Washington D.C. and doing a lot of work on behalf of the province of Alberta. And I think they might have a sense that they can be a little bit more delicate in their touch rhetorically with the Trump administration, because I think they think that they might have an energy carve out. Whereas in Ontario, not only is Premier Ford going into an election campaign. But, 1 in 3 people live in the province of Ontario, but Ontario constitutes more than 40% of the Canadian economy. 41% of Ontario's GDP is dependent on trade with the United States, and the backbone of that trade is the auto sector. So they are uniquely at risk here of these tariffs and what they mean. And this will hit right smack dab on the front end of an election campaign. And so Premier Ford having things to say, look, I am on Team Canada, but I also think we need to be tough if we need to be. I'm prepared to go to Mar-a-Lago, but I'm prepared to talk. Like, he needs to be a bit of a Swiss Army knife here in terms of his ability, his capacity to respond to these things politically. And I think that's responsible. That's good government. And I think the federal government, they're not being as outwardly as Doug Ford is because they're not on the precipice of a campaign. But I think that they're also preparing this in a similar way. And I think that's appropriate governance.
Yeah, well, look, they may be on the precipice of a campaign. I mean, who knows with the way things are now. But, Andrew, look, Reuters reported a few weeks back that they spoke to sources with knowledge of Trump's tariff plan. They say there were no plans for a carve-out for energy imports to the U.S. Who knows? I mean, there's a lot of things that people say close to Trump that turn out to change. So that is an unpredictable thing. But, what's your sense of what the federal government should do there? I mean, Doug Ford has his ideas, Danielle Smith, Andrew Furey, Francois Legault all have their plans. What do you think Justin Trudeau and company should do?
Yeah, so, I think this is where we're going to start to see, the politics come into play of where we're at federally. Trudeau has the opportunity to put together, and it sounds like he is about to put together another one of these multi-party, trade advisory tables. Lots of names being floated about today, from Rachel Notley to Carney being at that table, to try and help build a kind of Team Canada that's not dependent on the parochial interests of the premiers. That's actually not a bad spot for him to be in, to be able to play that. The one person who's being squeezed out of this conversation is Pierre Poilievre. Much harder for him to be able to reconcile a very powerful, very conservatively popular, if not popular publicly, Premier of Ontario, and at the same time one who's on exactly the opposite side in the Alberta heartlands. For Trudeau, he's actually in not a bad position to be able to maneuver around on this. The question is, what are the tools, to borrow Doug Ford's frame, what are the tools in the toolkit, and how many can you actually use? I'm not sure that needs to get rolled out quite yet. I think that this question of the anxiety building, he'll wait, he'll see what the right levers are to pull, and will build a case using those kind of multi-party tools that are available to him to be able to push that forward. Yeah, look, they're looking for all the tools in the toolkit, but the other guy's just got a big hammer, and that's and sometimes that's the one that does the most damage. So, Laura, one of the tools though is this 5-point border plan, and for what it's worth, like 2 weeks ago, we had the Premier saying the federal government's on its back foot; it doesn't have a plan. Since then, the Prime Minister's been to Mar-a-Lago, and now they have some sort of a plan that even Danielle Smith says looks like the base of something workable. How important is it to get that group, the First Minister's group, to this point?
I think it's very important to get the First Minister's group to the point where they are saying that they got a real plan. The First Minister's meeting, they got to see some of the things they wanted to, they were responded to. And I think it's important that for the federal government, that the premiers at least feel like they're being included, they're being listened to, because you can't build a multi-partisan plan, to Andrew's point, and table if you don't have all of those people at it, especially with the way partisan politics is currently playing out in Canada, where conservatism is very fractured right now between a progressive conservative government in Ontario and a deeply conservative government in Alberta, but also the Liberal brand is really challenged right now. Progressives are not aligned across the country either. And so to show that kind of unity is really important.
All right, Shachi, last word to you on this. If you have any thoughts on what appears to be an agreement at the First Minister's table, at least on border measures.
Well, we'll see if they can build on it, right? Can they build on that towards defense? Can they build on that towards other actions or other things that certain provinces may have to swallow around exports or other, hard things that are going to come? And, how do the provinces support each other? How do they stick together? And by the way, in any, we're also coming through a Canada post-strike, David, and the first rule of any of this kind of conflict resolution is don't negotiate in public. So, will we actually start to see the premiers now once they've pulled some of these levers and gotten some of these things off their chest, are they actually going to get down to the more quiet work of working together and working in tandem on a negotiation?
James, do you think there's any creative little accounting going on, looking at what they're doing at the border to see if they can count that towards defense spending to try to inch towards 2%? Helicopters and drones? I mean, maybe that can get you somewhere?
That's been the truth for a long, long time. I had a friend of mine told me a joke last week that if they can find a way to get the hunting rifles, they're apparently going to confiscate with the buyback if they can count that towards the 2% of GDP and sort of fudge a couple of numbers there. They'll kind of do anything because their commitments over the past years have not been serious to this point. There's no reason to believe they're serious going forward yet.
No, it's kind of a thing, though, that everyone in NATO does. In some way, they find things and find a way to stack it towards 2%. So here we are. Look, I appreciate the conversation. Thanks so much for being here. Shachia Curl, James Moore, Andrew Thompson, and Laura D'Angelo.